Yes, good evening from the United Kingdom, the heart of empire, the
Out of darkness.
Mm,
the land that gave the world its language, its beautiful language,
True,
and
true. Even though we now use it to undermine
yeah,
empire.
exactly. And yes, my name is Adeso Jigila. Once again, welcome to another episode of Kumbukeni. This time we're talking Cuba in Africa. And as regular, I'm with my co-hosts. I would ask them to introduce themselves, starting with the lady first.
uh, Nduko, that's a very English way, starting with a lady, but
Yes.
I'll take it.
Considering your conspiratorial thoughts.
I know. I am no lady.
I was about to say it on your behalf.
I am no lady. God knows I'm no lady. But yes, Nduko, fellow activist, revolutionary. Why do I call myself that? Because I am taking action against imperialism and against all forms of oppression, especially with a focus on African peoples all over the globe. Brother Alimadi.
Yes, yes, yes. Greetings, friends, sisters, brothers, comrades, to another episode of Kumbukeni. Our ultimate mission is to explain to our comrades and to the world how is it that the wealthiest continent in the world, Africa, also has the most impoverished people, and that this consciousness can uplift us into doing the things that we need to do to rectify this situation. So welcome, welcome, Milton Alimadi from New York City.
Okay, thank you for that. And today it's Cuba. Why Cuba? I guess the question is why not? When Nelson Mandela was released from prison, the first point of call outside South Africa was Cuba. And he got into the warm embrace of Fidel Castro. And one of the first questions Fidel Castro asked him was, Mr. President, have they told you about the weapons? He said, what weapons? Because it transpires that in the course of Cuba's adventures in Africa, they came to realize, through declassified papers, of course, that the United States had in fact helped South Africa to enrich nuclear weapons to build at least 7 atomic bombs. And to which Mandela then answered, oh no, they didn't tell me that. I think you should ask them, was his retort. So why is that statement important? That statement is important in the sense that while Mandela was on this visit to Cuba, he was still at that time on the US terrorist list. Let that sink in. So the next question is actually very, very important. On an interview with Ted Koppel, and American political analyst Ken Edelman asked the question, and I'll read. Mr. President, Yasser Arafat, Muammar Gaddafi, and Fidel Castro, anytime you are asked, your retort is, these leaders have helped South Africa. Are they the models for a future South Africa? To which Mandela answered, one of the mistakes of popular analysts everywhere is to assume that your enemies is our enemies. And that we won't do, because the foresight, the policy of South Africa going forward is that our attitude to any country is determined by the attitude of that country to us in our hour of struggle, which brings us to the question of Cuba. Cuba has undoubtedly been, regardless of its size, talk about a small ant, punching above its weight. regardless of his size, has been one of the most steadfast voices against imperialism and oppression on the African continent. And as a result, most of his sacrifices on the African continent has gone largely unnoticed, and to which we on Kumbukeni have decided, we're going to set the record straight. So I'll go to you, Sister. When do you believe in, going through your research, what is your initial take of Angola? I said Angola. You could start with Angola, of course, of Cuba's influence on the African continent.
I'll start, as you mentioned that last part before your question. I'll start with Che Guevara, who is a symbol of Cuban revolution. And despite the fact that he wasn't Cuban, but as I continue to read about Che Guevara, it really signifies his revolutionary style really signifies Pan-Africanism, internationalism, the fight. And he writes in one of his letters to his children, and he says to them, he advises his children that above all, they should always be capable of feeling deeply any injustice committed against anyone, anywhere in the world. It is the most beautiful quality of a revolutionary, he says. And so my encounter with Cuba, the strongest connection with them was with Che Guevara in his expedition in Congo. And he is sent by, he learned about Africa's revolutions, and he is sent by Castro. He requests, and he goes with Fidel Castro's blessings to Africa. And he ends up in Congo to study and see how they can help Africans fight for liberation. And one of his commanders explains in one of the videos we posted in the comments that Che's plan was to start a revolutionary movement with Cuba as the center, with Cuba as the epicenter, where it would expand throughout Africa, giving liberation to all of Africa. So, and honestly, if Africans were to smarten and wisen up and be more strategic and be more for Africa, that would be the ideal way to approach it, because Congo is the epicenter of imperialism. That is where all the wealth, that the majority, the main wealth that the imperialists are looking for is in Congo. And as long as Congo is weak, all of Africa will always be weak. And as long as Congo has imperialists within it, all of Africa will always be under the threat of imperialism. So yes, Congo is my epicenter.
Okay. I suppose the same question will go to Brother Milton Alimadi.
Yes. Okay. What is the specific question again?
So the question to you would be, what would you think was the driving motivation behind Cuba's interest in Africa?
Okay. Well, there were a couple. Number one, Cuba being a tiny country, as you mentioned, right next door to the vicious elephant who wanted to lift his foot and set it on Cuba's head. Cuba needed international allies. And in fact, as Sister Nduku said, Che said, we need internationalism. We need to create 3 or more Vietnams.
Yes.
To keep the enemy busy.
Busy, yeah.
Keep their hands tied up. So obviously it would have been great to help the revolutionary movements in African countries. And they had no choice to select Congo because of the brutal murder of Patrice Lumumba by imperialism and the installation of Mobutu, one of the most vicious beasts supported by imperialism in Africa for 37 years. I was speaking at an event a couple of days ago, and I was introducing Bobby Wine. the Ugandan, this young Ugandan who won the 2021 election, but General Museveni controls the army and the police and just said, so what, even if you won?
With the support of the United States.
Support of the United States.
Yes,
Thank you,
let's not
sister.
forget that.
Military support and $1 billion in U.S. taxpayers' money every year. So I said, in Museveni, we have a Mobutu of the 21st century. The MO is the same. You have to be anti-African, pro-imperialism, and they'll sustain you. If you're opposed to imperialism like Patrice Lumumba was, you're eliminated, you're liquidated. So Che, being such a compassionate and committed revolutionist, took a deep interest in the Congo, even though his preference, of course, was to be involved in South America.
Yeah, Bolivia. Yep.
Well, Bolivia eventually, but generally he wanted South America. But Castro said the environment is not ready for revolution. Since the Congolese are actually fighting a reactionary regime, maybe it's much more suitable. So why don't you go there? So they went, and his sister Nduku said he had hoped that given even the geographical location of the Congo, apart from the minerals concentration, let revolution spread to the rest of the continent, starting from the epicenter. And as Sister Nduku said, Congo remains the epicenter. Therefore, that imperialism is attacking because of its resources. And so long as Congo remains weak and exploited, the rest of the continent remains weak and exploited. That was the case in the 1960s, and it's the case today. And obviously, imperialism did another thing in the Congo by crushing Patrice Lumumba so violently, by even abusing the body. Think about it. After the man was dead,
how they do it,
desecrating the body. And you know the importance of the body in Africa, anywhere in the world, but particularly in our cultures. So to cut up the body and then to burn the body and then to crush the bones, that's how determined imperialism was to erase the presence of Patrice Lumumba. And last year, there was this tragic comedy setting where the so-called remains of Lumumba returned to the Congo from Belgium.
Hold on. Why were they in Belgium?
It was one tooth. His one tooth, which was the only thing which was not crushed, which was not the only thing you dissolved in sulfuric acid. One of the Belgian assassins who executed him kept it as a souvenir all these years.
Because that's what imperialists do.
And they do, but they call the Congolese and Africans barbarians.
And savages.
So the Cubans could not resist this abuse of the Congo, and that is why they became involved at that very early stage in the African struggle for liberation.
Two things I wanted to add at the surgery real quick as Alimadi is talking, because it was difficult to watch the videos and see them treating Lumumba the way they were doing. But the biggest disappointment was to see him sitting amongst Africans. That's who they used to kill him. He was sitting amongst people who should have been his brothers. They were mistreating him, carrying him, and treating him like he was an animal. And for me, the message to Africans is, why are we the ones helping out the imperialists to kill our own people just for a pat in the back? So that the Mzungu can say, you are the good Negro.
Sister, I want to add to that. Because when he was sitting semi-naked with his undershirt in that vehicle, knowing he was being taken for execution, you know what they were pressing in his mouth?
Yes, and he refused to take it.
Do you know what that was?
What was it?
That was the speech he had read.
To the
UN?
No, to the Parliament,
king.
to the Belgian king.
So do you think Mobutu alone by himself would have said, let's find that speech
Nope.
and shove it in his mouth? Who do you think would have inspired something like that?
And you can see it in one of the videos as well. You
The
can see the
Belgians.
Belgian
The Belgians,
king
of course. The
getting
Belgians
uncomfortable.
said not only should you kill him, but let him eat
It's the
the
speech.
speech that he read in front of our king. You know, so that scene, whenever it comes on any video, I switch the setting very quickly. I can't bear to watch that scene. Even the photograph, the still photograph. When I'm reading a book, I come to that, I quickly flip.
But Adesoji and Brother Milton, Adesoji, I'm sorry. This one, I don't know if we should have given it 3 hours, this episode, because there's a lot in here. What that reminded me of is every moment that I am in front of these, and I'll call them what they are, imperialists and oppressors, whether they're wearing nice suits in Washington or in New York, they are imperialists and oppressors. Every time I am in front of them, there's this thing they do, and they do this with African presidents. Why did you call us that? Why are you talking like that? You should say things like this. You're making us feel this way. And I'm like, oppressor, who cares how you feel? I'm talking about you oppressing me. Who cares how you feel? Adesoji.
Yeah, but then when you said you turn away from that, you turn away from that. What's it called? That picture.
Yes, I can't bear to watch that picture.
What about the letter? The last letter he wrote. The last letter he wrote. The
No,
words
no,
in.
I mean, I can read that letter.
Okay, I understand.
But
Yeah.
that humiliation
Listen, yeah.
of a brother
Mhm.
who was so dedicated
Yeah,
to the
to the cause of the
Congolese,
people. Yeah, to the
you
cause of
know,
his
to
people.
have him, you know, with his hand tied
Bound
viciously
behind. Yeah.
behind his back, you know.
I think that's what drove Shane angry. That's why he was
Yes.
like, yeah, I need to step in.
Yes.
So
I can feel that.
Yeah.
I mean, he did say in his famous speech at the UN,
Mhm.
he says every man worthy of that name should deem it fit to avenge the viciousness on the Congo. So it's incumbent on us to continue to mention Congo, and in so doing, also mention the name of Lumumba.
Right.
But then Cuba's influence did not just stop with the Congo.
No.
Another guest, another host of theirs was Amilcar Cabral
Mhm.
in Guinea-Bissau.
Yes. One of our greatest revolutionary theoreticians ever.
You want to take it from there?
More
Oh,
than a
absolutely.
theoretician, he took action as well.
Yes.
Mhm.
He combined, they call it praxis.
Indeed.
You know, praxis, you know, when you combine the theory and
Indeed.
the action. You know?
Yeah.
And of course, and if anyone has not yet seen this documentary, which I think we posted on the chat, the name, Cuba An African Odyssey,
We did.
made by Egyptian filmmaker Jihan El Tahri in 2011. That film does an excellent job in capturing the key aspects of the Cuban story in Africa. The meeting of the tricontinental meeting, which was hosted by Castro in 1966 and brought the leaders of revolutionary movements from all over the world, from Africa, from Asia, from South America. And at that meeting, both Castro and Che said, the leader that made the best impression was Amilcar Cabral.
Yes.
In his analysis of the weaknesses that they faced, the challenges they faced, the advantages that they faced, you know. And they determined that if we are to have success, because of course, the intervention in Congo was not successful. Ultimately, the United States intervened on a major scale, supporting Mobutu with weapons, with money, with mercenaries, and they were able to defeat the people who were fighting on behalf of Lumumba's dream. So, but the lesson they learned from the intervention in Congo was, how do we intervene in the future, and where do we intervene?
You intervene. Yep.
So at the 1966 meeting, they decided that Guinea Bissau, and Cape Verde, where the revolutionary struggle was being led by Cabral and his party, the PAIGC. This is where we should intervene. And I think that choice was vindicated when they saw how strategic Cabral was. Cabral did not want Cuban soldiers. He wanted to train his own army so that they can learn through practice how to become soldiers.
Yes, yes.
Do your own fighting. Because if somebody else is doing your own fighting, it means you're dependent on them.
Yes.
Go ahead.
And also, another key aspect was he was the first of the African revolutionaries to introduce women fighters.
Yes,
women
fighters in key roles, even as commanders.
Yep. Yes.
And what he wanted from the Cubans was strategic advice, logistical advice,
and training,
and weapons, of course, artillery pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And he got that. And of course, as they say, the rest is history.
Yes.
Ultimately, they succeeded in the struggle. They defeated the Portuguese in 1974. Sadly, imperialism used fellow people from Guinea-Bissau,
Africans,
to assassinate Cabral.
Cabral, yeah.
It's amazing how the person who pulled the trigger and fired the first shots was a part of the movement. At an earlier stage, he had been implicated in corruption and indiscipline. So he was brought to their tribunal that they have for the guerrillas. And the majority of the people involved in trying this commander had said, he should probably pay the ultimate price.
Yeah.
But it was Cabral who intervened.
Yes.
Who said, people need to be given a second chance.
Yeah.
Let him, prove himself. And he proved himself. And once again, he rose in the ranks. But it seemed to him that he had made up his mind that one day he would get his revenge, even though it was because of Cabral
that he was still around. Yes.
Yeah. So that was the sadness. And at the very end, even after he had been shot, he didn't die immediately. And his wife is there too. So it's very, very painful. When he was shot, he said, "Comrades, this is not how we resolve contradictions. Even at this moment, I'm still willing for us to air out our differences." And they paused for a minute to listen to what he was saying. But yet they decided to finish him off and they exterminated him.
Yeah.
So yes, another key aspect of the struggle with Amilcar Cabral was the fact that it was the first time that not only was it the first time that there were women combatants. What was also important to know there was, in asking for support from the Cubans, he insisted on one key aspect, that there be medical personnel.
Yes.
Because at that time, Portugal's policy in the colonies was one of, not training the people that would need to take over. So effectively, he was actually getting the people ready for...
No, I'm glad you said that, because in the areas they liberated, as you know, they set up shops where people could actually come and buy merchandise. They set up health centers where people could be treated. They set up schools where people would be educated. So you're right. They had set up administrative structures in all the areas that they had liberated. And just to add to what you just said, in 500 years of colonial rule in Mozambique and Angola, Portugal did not produce a single African doctor. Yes, think about that. 500 years. And colonialism was supposed to be a civilizing mission.
That was great to read Fidel Castro shaming the West for their lack of investing in training for doctors. The amount of of work that goes in Cuba to train doctors and the number of people they train, that Africa needs to wake up and learn from that, from Cuba. We need to train because that's an essential skill and it's essential
And they
resource
won't
to have.
train unless they have a revolution,
Yeah.
because when you have a revolution, then your priorities
And make your
Changes.
calls to Cuba.
are altered, But sister, you said in the beginning that Africans need to become, smarter in terms of when you're talking about Cuba's contribution. The smartness is there. That's, never been the main problem. It's the choices. It's the choices. In fact, in the 1960s, there was much more inclination to understand, empathize, and want to do what Cuba had done, using meager resources
To achieve.
and to get rid of a government that was vested in imperialism. An extension, in fact, of imperialism is what Batista's government was. So, but the way, and Africans saw what happened in Cuba and they were impressed by it. But then the post so-called independence leaders that came saw what imperialism did to Lumumba in the Congo, and that had a very chilling effect. And then they saw what was done to Kwame Nkrumah. And of course, Susan Williams' book explains it in very good detail. And they saw what happened to Kwame Nkrumah. So these kind of actions, Modibo Keita, in Mali, this had a very chilling effect. So even though the smartness was there, the courage just disappeared. Nobody, very few of them were willing to, they didn't want to end up the way these individuals ended up.
Okay. I mean, it's pause for thought that even as far as Cuba not minding its size, when it knew that, for instance, it knew that it only had the help of the Soviet Union, it was still willing to go against the Soviet Union to help an African country. And I call in question its action in the Ogaden War, the war between, the invasion of Somalia into Ogaden, the part of Ethiopian's territory.
Right.
And even though the Soviets were with the Somalis, bless you, the Soviets were with the Somalis at the time, the Cubans decided, you know what, our principle, I was actually going to mention this before I go on. It's important for one to understand that Cuba's guiding principles are two. One, Cuba was of the opinion that they would never involve themselves in internal affairs of any country.
Yes.
I.e., you were not going to support the government against the people or the people against the government. That sort of affairs is your internal affairs. But as far as international aggression is concerned, sign me up. So when Ethiopia reached out to Cuba, not minding the fact that Soviet Union was on the other side, sent over 12,000 troops, 300 armor tanks, and they were all there within 4 months. So when Soviet Union saw that the Cubans were not joking around, they quickly told the Somalis, but we told you not to invade. So they switched sides. So it was only a question of time before Somalia were, driven out of the Ogaden. At least they drove them out of 2.5 quarters of the area. They still hold a quarter of it. But again, that message is sent that if you call on the Cubans and you need their help, they are there. So to you, my co-host, I will ask the question: where else have we seen this sort of altruistic behavior from the West?
Oh God.
Well, First, I want to actually address that issue of that unfortunate war between Somalia and Ethiopia,
Mm-hmm.
which is, of course, a legacy of the colonial, uh, the Berlin Conference,
Hmm.
because the people of the Ogaden are actually Somalis, you
Somalis,
see.
yes.
But that's one of the most glaring manifestations of the arbitrariness of these borders, which were drawn by the colonials at the Berlin Conference. Um, and obviously, there should have been another way. I don't believe the position taken was correct
Hmm.
by the Organization of African Unity, that the colonial borders should be sacrosanct,
It should be respected.
because
Yes.
they would open up a whole lot of Pandora's boxes.
Mm-hmm.
But that's part of resolving problems. You have to open Pandora's box. As the Somali ethnic kin, literally same people, same culture, language, now separated by borders imposed by Europeans. I'm not saying the solution was for Somalia to invade, because obviously, now it belongs to Ethiopia, and Ethiopia is going to defend, quote
Its own
unquote, its territory. You see?
Mm-hmm.
So
territorial
that to
integrity.
me
Yeah.
is one of the things that actually we should probably focus on, this, the need for borderless Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this issue with Somalia would be, part of that conversation. And go ahead.
Hmm.
Go ahead.
No, I was gonna add when you mentioned the issue of borders. Another border crisis was one between Libya and Chad at the
Mm-hmm.
time, the Auzo Strip,
Correct.
which essentially is one lump of land the size of a hamburger that leads into Chad, which naturally should be part of Chadian territory,
Yep.
but is declared for Libya. And they went to war over this space.
Yeah. And it
You
has
know,
uranium too. So,
Ex-
imperialism
that
had its
focus,
eye on that.
that
I mean,
focus is the mind.
it's not just the soil.
Yeah.
There's something in it that they want, which
Yeah,
is why.
it focuses the mind. When you know there is stuff to be fought over. But
Yeah.
again, it goes to the issue of these arbitrary borders.
Mhm.
There are places in West Africa. I mean, I'll give you an example. Look at the Western Sahara.
Mm-hmm.
Classic example. Nowhere there is no commonality between Morocco and the people of Western Sahara.
Mm.
No commonality, no language, nothing. But here you're claiming it. So it begs the question, at what point do we actually then sit down and say, you know what? Let the people decide where they want to be.
Right. And in the case of
Now,
Western Sahara,
Yeah.
Morocco has actually blocked the plebiscite, which was called for by the UN about 30 years ago.
Yeah,
Actually, more. Think about it.
1975. December. They went in December 24, 1975.
So we're talking almost 40 years.
Almost 40 years, yes.
and the US still doesn't recognize Western Sahara as a nation, do they?
No, the US recognizes it as a territory of Morocco.
Yeah, they don't recognize it as a nation. This is and to me, as I was going through the research, seeing all this, oh, the US doesn't recognize, oh, the US doesn't recognize, I'm like, brothers, like, who made them the boss of the
Yeah,
world?
but at least they call themselves the Sahrawi Democratic Republic.
That's
yeah.
what the Western Sahara call themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they have some support from the African Union, finally. And of course, that's one of the reasons why Morocco actually came back
Yep.
to the African Union, so that it can lobby against and eventually once again get the Sahrawi expelled.
But according to during the U.S. African Leadership Summit this past fall, according to the U.S. State Department, the countries that were not included, and I believe Western Sahara was one of them, I'm not sure, but the countries that were not included was decided by the AU. It was decided by the AU.
Right, but the AU, at least when I last checked, 60% of its budget is financed from outside Africa. So, the AU
Conflict of interest all over the place.
decide in theory, but in practice, we know who really decides.
Who pulls the strings? So
One of the many contradictions we
Yeah.
face. But I also want to emphasize the size of Cuba.
Yes.
I think in the beginning, Brother Desoji said, regardless of the size. But I think it's actually because of the size that Cuba has really, as you said, punched well above its level. It's because of its size, very small. It's because of its population, very small, that Cuba made the decision that we have to maximize our smallness and get all we can from our smallness. Living, as I said, lying right next to the elephant who can just roll over anytime during its sleep and crush little Cuba. And I say this to contrast with our beloved motherland. And I say this to young people in the motherland, in Africa. Please do whatever you need to do to get rid of useless governments. Cuba has come to the rescue of Africa many times. Today we are focusing on the independence struggle. But Cuba has also come to our aid, even economically, with its meager resources.
Health,
Sending doctors, building these clinics,
indeed,
intervening during Ebola,
in places like Somalia during
the COVID pandemic. Think about it. With today's population is 12 million. 12 million, right? The population of New York City exceeds that of Cuba, right? Africa, 1.3 billion. And yet it took Cuba to come and do our wars of liberation for us. So to me, when people deserve to be ashamed, you should tell them to be ashamed.
Yeah, I am all for public shaming.
You're building all these big armies instead of saying, okay, now that I have a big army, let me contribute some of these weapons and soldiers to help fight against Portuguese colonialism and to fight against apartheid. No, instead, these soldiers are brutalizing civilians in the African countries. So these are shameful things that we need to talk about, these contradictions,
To your question, Brother Desoji, altruistic, our community is saying in the chat, in the comments, altruistic and the West do not go together. An oxymoron, which I agree. The whole idea of imperialists is to serve themselves and not others. But the other thing I noted as I was going through my research on Cuba is the mention of, first of all, when Patrice Lumumba dies, Cuba has a 3-day mourning holiday in honor of Lumumba, because a huge percentage of Cubans recognize their ancestry back in Congo.
To Congo, yeah.
So these are Africans in Cuba. And the one thing I also noted is, as Che Guevara and Fidel Castro are planning that expedition to Congo, they specifically instruct the commander to recruit people who had dark skin.
Yes.
And I took it as a positive, number one, because they recognize that the Africans will want to see people who look like them, but also strategy. You don't want to be going there and sticking out like a sore thumb in that place where, So I don't know. I don't know if it's me who's romanticizing Cuba or if it's me who's reaching for the generosity that they have. But I see them being very humane in the way they approach this support that they give and wherever they go. But
I mean, one can be guided by Amilcar Cabral's statement that Cuba is the only country in the world that came to the aid of Africans, and the only thing they took away from Africa were their dead combatants.
Which answers your question as far as if there's any other country that's
I mean, I know there are cynics in the audience, but we should be grateful for the little things they give us. But
but that is where I also have my other issue of shaming. The Africans. Angola would have been some reactionary state run by a person like Batista, had the CIA managed to install either Holden Roberto or Jonas Savimbi. You know, ironically, Savimbi actually was well versed in Marxism, Leninism, and was actually
better
supposedly
suited
a socialist at some point.
Yeah.
But obviously, many people have a price as well. So his price, he ended up being
a capitalist.
Not only a capitalist, but an agent of the CIA. You know, so he would have ended up. Either one of them would have ended up had it not been for the intervention of Cuba. So my bigger point is this: Angola then becomes this mineral-rich producing country, oil, gas, you know, precious, you know, minerals, stones. And you're telling me that you're waiting for Cuba to come and say, you should give us something for our sacrifice? This is something you can't initiate on your own? To me, it's mind-boggling. It is so un-African because, first of all, Africans don't behave like that. Africans appreciate when help is extended, and normally they, you know, reciprocate this kind of generosity. So that's one thing I've always found quite amazing. I'm glad you brought up that topic to remind me. Cuba deserves to be, you know, it's good. Solidarity is good, but sometimes people need financial resources too.
Even if it's not tokens of appreciation, it is all the embargoes that have been put against Cuba, the financial, the economic restraint that has been put on them. Africa should say to these people who are doing that to Cuba, who has been there for Africa, we are not doing business with you until you end this.
Sister, I don't know how you managed to read my notes because that's one of my points.
Don't we share ancestors? We have a spiritual connection, Brother Alimadi.
One of my points, I said the most disappointing thing for me is that the Africans have not put as much fight against lifting the embargo against Cuba as they put in the fight against destroying apartheid in South Africa. Had they done that, the embargo would have been lifted by now. Thank you for hammering on that.
That's actually a call to action to all African leaders who end up sitting in their beds when someone else is doing the work, the hard work of leading a nation, and looking at YouTube. Museveni, if you're looking at YouTube, what's his name again in my country, Kenya? President Ruto, if you're looking on YouTube, and all the other presidents. If you're looking on YouTube and you end up on Kumbukeni, this is a call to action. Ask the imperialists, the oppressors, to end the embargoes on Cuba, to release Cuba and let Cuba do business wherever it wills.
I think
they're demanding an end on embargo against Zimbabwe. They should put it in, you know, in the same sentence.
Yeah, there is
Zimbabwe and Angola.
We're not doing business with you. You have no access to our resources.
And then keep quiet.
You cannot bring your companies in our countries. Can you go back home?
I will speak up for my African brothers. They actually, you know, they put out a resolution, you know, to put that on the table of the General Assembly. But I mean, it's been ongoing now for.
Resolution can sit there for decades.
You share. How long has it been going?
Over for 3 years.
Comrades. There was a resolution to end apartheid in the 1960s, right? It took Cuban blood to end apartheid. Yes. So we need more than resolutions. We need Africans to be very vocal. They're becoming much more vocal on Zimbabwe. In public settings, they talk about it. Talk about Cuba. Don't be afraid.
But your leverage is resources. For heaven's sake, what is all this penmanship when it comes to revolution? Your leverage is resources. These people are in your countries for resources. These people want to do business in your country so that they can build wealth. So say no more.
Yep, Cuba.
I'm sorry, I can't.
No, for real.
You know, so which brings us to actually Angola.
Yes.
So, question is, how did that even happen? I mean,
it happened because
the Russians come in.
It happened because Castro was the leader at that time. Had there been another individual, probably Savimbi or Holden Roberto would have ended up being president.
But also because both Che and Castro could not stand the South Africans and the way they treated people.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Apartheid, when I think they overextended their hands, actually. Sister is right. Had they found a way to support Roberto, who was, of course, based in what was in Zaire, Congo,
Yep.
where the CIA funneled money through Mobutu and weapons. Had they found a way to support Savimbi, UNITA, Jonas Savimbi, who was operating from the south,
Yep.
without the indignity of bringing white South African soldiers to do the fighting
For you.
in Angola, I think they might have actually managed to succeed, but they went a bit too far, right? When they had European soldiers from apartheid South Africa
Fighting against their own brothers. Yeah.
No. That's when Castro said, and it's funny because as Tahir's film tells us, this is because there were two major interventions. One was in 1975, just on the eve of Angola's independence from Portuguese rule.
Yep.
Where you have the contesting armies, the socialist/Marxist MPLA under Dr. Agostinho Neto. You have the reactionary UNITA under Savimbi, the FNLA under Olden Roberto.
Yeah.
Now contesting for power.
And then you also had the Congolese coming in from the north.
Right. Yes. You had the Congolese army actually fighting with FNLA, and you have the South Africans
coming from the south.
And strategizing together.
At that time, the major presence was coming through Congo, actually. So creating another front line in addition to coming from the south. They also came from the Congo. So the MPLA was literally gone, and they called Castro for help. And they said, this is what we need. And Castro analyzed the troops converging and said, you're wrong. This is what you need.
What you need, yeah.
A lot more.
A lot more, yeah.
As the Angolan commander said, we went asking for sugar. He said, no, you don't need sugar. You need cooks, you need food, you need... And that is how they managed to defeat these converging forces. And that's how the MPLA managed to create the first government in 1975. So maybe Sister can pick up on the second major intervention, Cuito Cuanavale, in 1987.
So for me, see, I'm looking at South Africans as very sneaky. I don't know why when I'm thinking of them, I'm seeing snakes and deception. And I have the same attitude, which is what I hear Western media refer to Africans and revolutionaries, their attitude. I know in one of the videos they mentioned that when the Cuban the delegation was in Egypt, they were having these talks about Angola and South Africa getting out. When the Cubans spoke, they accused South Africans of their hatred, their racism, and all that, and the South Africans were offended. And in my head, I'm thinking, really? But no, anyway, so
a racist doesn't like being called a racist.
That's the thing.
I can understand that part.
And but here's the thing: we, as those who have suffered under racism, we as those who've been oppressed and exploited, we need to stop caring about how they feel about us calling them out, because it will never be comfortable to tell your oppressor that they are oppressing you. It will never be a good delivery. So we just need to say it and not worry about how they feel. But so they've stopped helping, and South Africa finds a way back in. And remind me his name again. UNITA's leader.
Jonas Savimbi.
Savimbi, yes. And Savimbi is still trying to get power. He's actually reached out to Washington.
Under Reagan.
Ronald Reagan allows Savimbi to come to the US. And he actually asks him, dude, what do you want? And Savimbi is like, oh, I don't want this, I don't want that. And he's like, nah, come on. What do you want? Name anything, I'll give it to you. And that's when he asks for the stingers, right?
Yep.
And
which even Saudi Arabia
At the
I
time,
know
they did not.
allowed to buy.
they're saying we haven't even let Saudi, as if Saudi Arabia is supposed to be over here as opposed to Africa. We haven't even let the Saudi Arabians have those. You cannot give it to him. And Ronald Reagan stops and pauses and says, yeah, give it to him. Give the man what he wants. He wants stingers. And so that's what they bring back and it increases their forces. But South Africa comes back in. And Cuba finds out about this, and Castro says the only way they're going to do this is to send more troops and to send more weaponry, and they do so. And yes, they do so. And one thing, just to bring humor to all this talk, because sometimes it gets painful, is, which was not a good thing, but the CIA gentleman.
He's not a gentleman. Sorry.
Well, we're using their term so that we know them.
No,
but we know there's nothing gentle about them.
I veto that.
We will call them what they have told us they are, but we know what it means. We know there's nothing gentle about gentlemen, but we will call them as such so that we know. Because when you say gentleman, you know who you're going to be facing. You're not facing a gentle person. But he says the way they would tell, the way the Americans would tell that there's increase in troops coming into Angola is by the number of baseball fields. Yep. I found that interesting because Cubans always made sure that there was a baseball field for a certain amount of troops. But yes, so they bring back troops to South Africa to support them and more weaponry.
Okay.
Yes. But also, here again, we have to talk about how Castro once again defied the Soviets.
Mm-hmm.
When he intervened in 1975,
I was actually going to mention that.
The Soviets, because he knew the Soviets would debate and then might persuade him not to.
They wanted to impress the U.S. Yeah,
it'll be too late to take the troops once on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and in 1987 at Cuito Cuanavale, it made a big difference because the Soviets had convinced the Angolans, said, listen, we're the ones who actually supply Cuba. So listen to us, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be your military advisors. And in one battle alone, before the Cuban massive intervention, the Angolans lost 2,000 soldiers.
Yeah.
All the major weapons destroyed. And Castro said, you're going to be annihilated unless you do it my way. And that's when the massive intervention by Cuba.
I think he actually says, you Russians, you don't know how to fight war in Africa. We Cubans know how to fight war in Africa.
Which is true.
And also, I mean, a direct quote of his was the fact that I have told you Angolans, why are you fighting in an open field? You have to understand that Jaba, where Jonas Savimbi was, is at the end of a desert. So how are you going to move through a desert and not raise dust? You need helicopters to move, and you move at night. So for him, it was strategy.
And in fact, do you remember what the South African defense minister himself said? General Mangas or Malas?
Malas.
Remember what he said?
Yeah, go on.
He said, I don't understand today how he could do it over a satellite phone.
That was funny. You talk about that, Brother Alimad. You talk about Adesoji. That was impressive.
He said Castro is all the way in Havana. And he was commanding.
He commanded that, yes. He commanded that.
And also, the most important thing was the guy who played the commander, the guy who commanded the troops on the ground, because when they got in, the first thing they said after obviously the defeat that the Angolans suffered was to tell Eduardo dos Santos that you have to cede command of the southern troops to this guy named Filcio Fichu. Fichu actually fought under Castro during the battle, the defining battle against. Yeah. So he trusted him with his life. So Castro would only speak directly to that general and not to speak to anybody else. So
not even the Angolans.
Not even the Angolans. So he spoke directly to the general and he asked the general, what do you need? So the general said, I need helicopters and I need boats. What do you need helicopters for? I need helicopters to land me behind the
Enemy
South
line.
Africa.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
I was like, what do you need that for? It's like, yeah, I need them to land me behind enemy lines.
Yeah.
And I need X number of troops. And I'm doing it on this day. Why are you doing it on this day? Because there will be fog.
You see?
Strategy.
It's all about strategy. Many things
Strategy.
can be accomplished.
By the time they arrived at the landing situation, they were literally right in front of the South Africans. So the South Africans won. The shock, they was retreat. So normally when retreating soldiers retreat, they blow up bridges and what have you.
Right. And
They-
They didn't have
their
enough.
weapons as well. They also destroyed,
Exactly.
right?
So they couldn't destroy their weapons. So it was retreat. So the fear was once they retreated out of Namibia, the fear was will the Cubans and the Angolans come into
South
South
Africa.
Africa?
Correct.
That is when they went to the
Oh,
UN.
it's
to
time
go
to
and-
talk. It's time to
Yeah,
talk.
exactly. That's when they went to the UN to have the conversation.
Yeah.
And guess who was leading the conversation? The United States.
Yep.
Yes.
Who should
But
have been on the side of the,
at that point, Castro said, "Let them lead anything. I have my men in control of Cuito Cuanavale."
exactly.
This is the United States supporting an apartheid system, so that you understand. This goes is important for reference for Black Americans, descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States. At the same time, you're fighting against apartheid in the U.S. and in South Africa. The nation that governs you, the nation that is supposed to be protecting you,
Right.
giving you your civil rights, is out there defending apartheid.
Yeah, but that makes sense. Because they're on the
It
same
does,
page,
but
it's not surprising.
because we have Black people who think the U.S. is the best thing since sliced bread.
No, I mean, listen, people would gravitate towards anything that makes them feel comfortable. So that being said, the issue I have with the United States when it comes into Africa is one of the way it moves on Africa is very brazen. It doesn't hide its hand.
No apologies.
What's his name? Devlin, the man, the man
CIA
on
head of
the
CIA in
CIA.
Congo.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You remember what he said when he came to the issue of what they were going to do to Lumumba?
Oh,
He
yeah.
said the choices were they came to me, they brought me some toothpaste.
Yeah.
That
No, they
was
brought him a collection of poisons.
Yeah.
One of them was the
so
toothpaste.
that I had to then lock in my safe because I didn't want anybody just, the
Anyone in the
effort-
office to walk in
eff-
and use the toothpaste.
Exactly, the effrontery that I mean, at that time he was sat in Congo
Mhm.
because that interview was held with him in Congo. It wasn't held in,
Manipulating, still causing friction and wars. Yeah.
So, but people, you seem to have a surprising tone in when you're speaking. We should not,
It's
we can
not
analyze
surprise.
these things with no element of surprise.
No, I'm not.
or-
It's
No,
not
I'm-
surprise.
wow.
It's overwhelming. It's upsetting.
As Brother Walter Rodney reminded us in that lecture, Crisis in the Periphery. And that to me is one line that I always emphasize in all my thoughts. At one point in the history of setting up this global system, we too were commodities. Think about that.
Yes, indeed.
If we too were commodities and not human beings, there's nothing else that should surprise us. I always reflect on that context. So a Devlin sitting there, spewing all that nonsense, sense of entitlement, not even questioning that, what right do I have to be in Africa?
He was so proud of himself
right
too.
do I have to be deciding over the fate of a democratically elected African leader and chuckling about it? I was not even annoyed by that because that to me is very typical
I was.
reaction. To me, I was more pained when, of course, a fellow so-called African was shoving the speech in Comrade Lumumba's mouth. That actually really hurt me a lot.
But that
Because
reminds
told
me.
Go ahead.
Go on, brother.
No, because that told me how much the mind of that African had been thoroughly corrupted by the attitude transmitted by people like Devlin,
It reminds me of another incident like that, where an African steps in because they want a pat in the back by Devlin. When Lumumba gives his secretary the letter to Russia.
Yes, correct. The telegram, right.
To ask for support.
Yep.
Because the US has denied support. And another secretary in the office takes the letter from the secretary's desk and takes it to was it Devlin's office? He takes it to it ends up in the hands of the CIA.
Right, Devlin.
Yes. And this is someone in the office, in Lumumba's office, that does this. And this
Somebody
is what begins.
who's probably under the payroll.
Right. Who is probably being treated well by Lumumba. This is what I'm talking about when it comes to Black people. You are so in the way of your own liberation. It is not even funny.
Yeah, but then you also have to understand that at that time, in terms of civil service, Congo never had a civil service. So all these people you had walking around were just hang-arounds. They didn't understand how
that's no excuse.
No. But they don't understand how a state functions.
But that's no excuse.
Hold on. Compare that to Ghana. Compare it to Ghana. The first time Lumumba sat in the same space with a white man was when he went across the river in Congo, Brazzaville. So one has to put all of these things into context. I'm not excusing it, but what I'm just saying.
I don't think we should.
I can only say that it's possible that this person did not know
the gravity of what they're doing.
The gravity of what they were doing.
Nope.
And it would end up ultimately.
Let us stop excusing bad behavior.
There's no excuse, but
they took a letter that they knew was not meant for them.
Okay.
To me, there's even a bigger issue than that. I think when it came to the time when there was still opportunity after Lumumba had escaped, when the few African countries that were independent at that time, there's an airport at Kisangani, right, in Eastern Congo. They should have recognized Lumumba immediately as the only legitimate ruler.
Yes.
And have him call for intervention by African countries. Egypt, Ghana, they could have landed, So when we look at what could have been done and all that, I think there are other things that go beyond that telegram. But of course, I understand the sisters.
But that telegram is what begins the process to get him killed.
Yeah, because when they saw that telegram, they said, okay.
He's a communist.
We must take, every measure, including exterminating him. And you're right. That's when.
Because I believe without the support of the US, Belgians would not have succeeded. So that support by the US is what helps them. The support
definitely
through the CIA is what helps Belgians.
Right. And I'm glad you brought that point, because then thereafter the US becomes the effective imperial power in Africa, because all the European countries had been economically devastated anyway after World War II.
Yeah, World War II.
Yeah.
Right.
And effectively, that airport that the UN Secretary General was last seen at would effectively become part of the US sphere of influence. So when the Cubans were in that neck of the woods, the Cubans were worried that up north, you had French, the Belgians, and the Americans. And they used a collective term to describe them, NATO. So for them, whilst they were in Angola, the key thing was, as long as we have these numbers here, nothing is going to happen. And they specifically warned the Angolans. Strategy is key. Don't go chasing multiple rabbits. You're not going to catch one. Because there was a time they were attacking a base in the east and one in the west. And Castro was asking them, what is wrong with you people? You need to, because the Russians obviously were giving them weapons. But the Cubans were saying, listen, yes, you have the weapons. They still had to be used strategically.
The Russians They have history of fighting, of course,
Mm-hmm.
but mostly conventional wars. You see,
Yeah.
when they fought in World War II, very conventional, destroy the Nazi regime. Even when they fought in World War One, even during the when it was still under, you know, the remnants of Saudism, the army
Mm-hmm.
was not yet that really professional. But the Cubans, they fought in the Sierra Maestra. They fought in the mountains, so they had much
Yeah.
more.
Castro actually used that as a differentiating factor when he was talking to the Russians advisors. He
Mhm.
said, "I give you kudos. You fought in Stalingrad. You fought, but we fought in the mountains. Look around
Exactly.
you. Look around you. What do you see?"
Yep. The terrain is very,
Exactly.
Similar.
So
Hmm.
step
and,
back.
and also one thing, let's also, I think mention. I think after that we should probably look. We have some comments in the audience,
We
so we
do.
should address those. But the decisiveness, in history, of course, the timing and decisiveness is very critical.
Hmm.
How many times did Castro have to make very crucial decisions that impacted the fate of Africa? Many times, of course,
Hmm.
including securing independence from the MPLA in 1975, and then the Battle of Cuito Cuanavale. You know,
We're also forgetting the impact that victory had on Mozambique,
Hmm.
yes,
because when Ian Smith of the old Rhodesia, which would then become Zimbabwe, was founded
Renamo.
Renamo, a destabilization force in Mozambique against Frelimos, and these guys couldn't really contain them. Again, he brings into hypocrisy the West, the way they move. At that time, they had what was called the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, which was headed by the later Prince Consort, Prince Philip. And
King Philip
no, Prince Philip.
At the
He
at the
time.
wasn't.
time.
He
At the
wasn't
time.
at the time. No, there's only it was a queen, so he couldn't be king. So, um, and Zimbabwe was tied to the crown, but this guy was funding a body of people that went into a nature reserve and wiped out nearly all the animals,
Hmm.
for which the king, the prince consort, was a patron. I mean, look at that contradiction in terms. And
They have no value for life,
and
nature.
so and so when Cuba comes into the picture, the Americans and the South Africans begin to look over their shoulders like, what's going on here? Because the more the fact that, oh yeah, there's an optics that was missing in our deliberation. It was the fact that the guys that defeated the South African force were mostly black.
Yeah.
And that fact was not shown in South Africa because they had a blanket ban on newspapers and TV stations showing the
Black
fight.
people could not be shown in them.
That's it. Because the moment you show
Well,
that
it
you're
can
gonna
be shown as impoverished, dependent people,
Oppressors are so
but not
petty.
so
defeating South African soldiers.
soldiers
So
who are
petty.
so that I mean I when I saw that I chuckled to
I
myself. I was
mean,
like,
we're gonna go to audience. There's some comments and questions, but as we go to the audience, I want to say that we argue all the time about whiteness and blackness and what is this about. But when you think about something like that, where they won't even have black people showing there because of what that represents. But just to remind our audience, do join our Patreon family, our Patreon community to support us and help us to continue doing this work at patreon.com/Kumbukeni or subscribe. Subscribing costs you nothing. You don't even have to be here to see the shows. We would love you to be here so that you can learn and join us in the movement, the revolutionary movement to free our continent. at youtube.com/at Kumbukeni1. Brother Langston Morrison, he says, how do we reconcile all the work Baba Amilcar Cabral has done for the liberation of African people with his love for Portuguese language and culture as a substitute for indigenous African languages? Before you answer that, brothers, I welcome you to join me in picking the questions and observations you want to point out. But let's look into that one.
Okay. Actually, that's something that I've always thought about. I, of course, consider myself as an activist against imperialism and exploitation. I happen to do it in the English language. That's the language I've been speaking, for such a long time.
I can teach you some Kiswahili.
But the brother is serious, I think, is the question.
Yeah.
And it's not out of choice, I think had I grown up speaking Kiswahili all the time, reading Kiswahili books, but then I would also have some limitations. How would I communicate with the larger, African diaspora? How would I be communicating right now on this show, for example, if I was speaking in Kiswahili? So that's, part of the contradiction. Cabral grew up when the country was Portuguese colony, when very few were lucky enough to get educated. He was so brilliant, and it helped, of course. His father was a teacher, his mother was a laborer, but he was so brilliant that he won a scholarship to go to the belly of the beast.
Portugal.
He was so brilliant that he was tutoring the children of the principal of his university in Lisbon in Portuguese. He was so brilliant that he was going to the neighborhoods, working class, to share his education. So he was doing what later on Rodney was doing, in the grounding.
Groundings,
Yeah. So a guy like that, I would take a guy like that as opposed to a guy who's using the same Portuguese culture and language to become like a Jonas Savimbi or to become like a,
Yoweri Museveni.
With English. I would become like a Olden Roberto, you see. But I understand the brother's point as well, because Ngugi has always been.
I was going to mention him. Yeah.
Ngugi emphasizes that we must speak our African languages. We must write, African languages. And now he writes his books in Gikuyu, and then it's translated into English. And I applaud him, and I think that is the right thing that ultimately has to be done. But in the interim, let's use the language of the colonizer to fight the colonizer until we come to a time where perhaps Kiswahili is widely taught in every African school from primary level, and that it becomes widely spoken.
And this goes into strategy, Brother Alimadi. We as Africans, if we must unite, right? And one way to unite is in language, so that we can. The only way we are going to defeat or change this narrative where English is the dominant language is if we unite, because we can't be all over the place with, are we speaking Yoruba, are we speaking Hausa, are we speaking Kiswahili? If we're going to be fighting English, let's sit down and decide what language will we all as Africans learn to unite us, so that we can educate our people. So let's decide, Africans, and let's start learning.
But it's also important with regards to the question of language that the borders be open so that people move around. One way that language transmits is when people travel. And so when you engage with people, even people who don't sit in a formal setting to learn a language would, in the course of interaction, pick up certain bits of said languages. And before you know it, you're communicating, which is the issue of unity. Because, yes, you can have a single language, but then if you're not moving around, you're going to be sat in silos. Because, there are lots of countries in the eastern part of the continent that speak Swahili, but they don't get along. Why is that? So why is that? So I think, yes, it's okay to have a language, but it's also important that a movement of people be much more accessible, because If a railway, you
The
have
borders. That's a
yes,
shorter way of saying it. Just
yeah.
remove all
So
the borders.
remove all the borders. So if you
Yeah.
have a railway that extends from Tanzania all the way to Egypt,
That
that's a
would be amazing.
that's a corridor.
Talk
That's a
about
corridor.
revolution.
That's a corridor of people. So again, I mean, you have the river Niger that comes in from Mali. Mali is on the tip of West Africa and comes right into the belly of Nigeria. That's an entire swathe of countries, about 16 of them in total, that can be picked up on that river alone. So if you have movement if you build a railway line along that river to the Atlantic Ocean in Senegal, imagine.
Yeah.
So yes, it's important, but we also
Yeah. Brother Langston also points out the two sides of Mobutu and how we reconcile that. He wanted to do away with colonial names and statues and monuments and all, but at the same time, he was colonizing and enslaving his own people, not to mention his role in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. Adesoji, you have something to say?
No, you said he wanted to do away with colonial names and statues and monuments. Okay. So he replaces the country that is named according to the river with a name that has no meaning. And he was there for close to 30 something odd years. What did he do? The Yorubas will say, which is if somebody's going to offer you an apparel, you check what they're wearing. Someone who with rags is not going to offer you a fine linen. It's not going to be possible. So
my response to Langston was there's no amount of statues and renaming that can take away the stain and curse of participating in the murder of Patrice Lumumba. So
no, let's even discount the killing. Let's discount that, for instance. The first part of it alone is nonsensical. It's nonsensical.
No, I think in fact, Mobutu actually played that Africanization thing as propaganda. He promoted the wearing of
Kaunda suits,
not Kaunda suits, but colorful Congolese attire. Obviously, he was using it as propaganda to wrap himself in the mantle of Pan-Africanism, while, as Brother Desoji said, doing the exact opposite. But in terms of the symbolism, actually he did. The symbolism, he had that leopard skin, hat. He had his clothes tailored in traditional African outfit. In fact, because of him, many Congolese started wearing that and abandoning the European clothes. But look at the trade-off, as the sister said. That trade-off,
the unrest,
compared to accepting all aspects of imperialism. And the ultimately also murdering our.
I would rather he wear suits all his life and tuxedos his life and look like a Western person, but there's peace in Congo and they have independence as far as economic independence, political independence. Mobutu can wear suits until he dies.
And not drink pink champagne.
And not drink pink champagne that is delivered in, what was the jet in his personal?
No, the Concorde flies it to Badolite every other 2 weeks.
So. Yeah. So here's another one. How do we reconcile? How do we think about cultural genocide? What do we think about cultural genocide?
I think
it goes into that.
We can't address that until we have mental decolonization.
Yeah.
We have to, first of all, remind and teach Africans to love themselves. Because once you do that, the rest they will be able to accomplish by themselves.
Exactly.
And I always give the example of my students, when I run into them after one semester in my class, they're not the same people anymore.
One semester, imagine that.
One semester.
Just one semester is all it takes.
We get into business the first day of class,
Why are you here?
No, really. Actually, I make them write a statement, and at the end of the semester, they compare their initial statement with
what
the person they've become,
is.
And they can't believe it.
Listen,
it can be done. Is the main point. But we need to decolonize the mind first. Then they love themselves, they love other Africans, they love their culture, their history, their tradition. And then nobody can deceive them by demonizing them,
Yeah.
saying, oh, these were backward savages, blah, 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 you know. As Malcolm X said, and I keep using this, and this is my final point, go to YouTube, watch You Can't Hate the Roots of a Tree without hating the tree.
Yep.
It is under 6 minutes long, and Malcolm addresses that issue that we are speaking about right now.
And also, there's an old African saying, which is, you have to love what others love for themselves before you truly embrace your Africanness. Like Nkrumah said, I was not born in Africa. Africa was born in me.
There you go.
So you have to, it's an innate character of yours. So you can't be, I mean, it can be turned on, just like Brother Milton just said now. But if you don't have it, it's going to be...
Okay, very good. I'm glad you said that it can be turned on, because in that same speech, Malcolm says, deep down in his subconscious, you know, the black man in this country is actually very closely tied to his African culture, his African heritage, his African tradition. He just doesn't know. And the reason why the Nation of Islam became very successful was by tapping into the culture, the history, the tradition. And then the African American here in this country realized that, wow, I actually like that.
Yeah.
You know, so Malcolm addressed that aspect as well.
Yeah. We unfortunately have a movement that is taking a lot of them from a small percentage of African Americans away from that.
No, that movement is small, it's reactionary, it's getting coverage way beyond.
Much,
exactly. I won't even
mention them,
beyond their pool.
Yeah.
You know.
Our sister Aya Eneli asks, what does Africa really want? I see many who just want to reproduce the West in Africa. I don't think we envision an Africa on our own terms. That's a good one, brothers.
No, that's excellent. Part of the problem is that, you know, Western propaganda has become so powerful and so effective that, you know, the Africa that Africans want, first of all, many Africans don't have a vision of Africa that is different from the Western vision of Africa. And how can that change? That can only change by education, right? By what you're exposed to.
True.
And that can only come through the schools, right? So let me give you an example, and then Brother Adesoji can tackle this question. In Uganda, the Minister of Education is the wife of the dictator. Her name is Janet Museveni. It's widely speculated that even though she claims to have a graduate degree, somebody wrote the degree for her, did the papers for her at Makerere University. She's the Minister of Education, when in fact education should be the most important portfolio in any government, right? And it's not surprising that the education system is in a shambles in Uganda. I don't even know what they teach, really.
The day is coming.
That's my response. We have to start with education so that we know that we can actually have a vision of Africa, which is not from the outside, you know?
Education is a key to liberation.
Well, on the same theme of education,
good education.
Only recently did history come back onto the curriculum in Nigeria. You're talking about a country of about
time out. You know, I thought this was actually a joke.
No, it's not a joke.
A few years ago, I was having a conversation with a Nigerian friend, and he was telling me that, you know, there's a move to eliminate history because the government are saying, oh, we need to focus more on science and technology. What help?
Guess who told them that?
Of what use is history? Now the brother is confirming that this was not a joke.
It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a joke. I mean, as far back as what's it called, 1999, history took a backseat on the educational curriculum in Nigeria. And then, so if you don't have an understanding of what has gone before, what are you building on? China is 5,000 year civilization. Let that sink in for an instance. Britain will trace itself back to the Norman Wars of 1066 when King William the Conqueror became the King of England.
Which is really nothing compared to Africa when
Exactly.
Kemet was united 3,200 years before Christ.
Exactly.
And before that, there were already lost kingdoms.
So, now, if you go into just the history of Benin, the Benin Kingdom, of which the Benin bronzes came from.
Yeah, the spectacular, beautiful.
That is an aspect of the history that is devoid of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
That is devoid of meaning to the average Nigerian.
It's sickening, to be honest with you.
Yeah,
if you go to China as a dignitary, right? Where are they going to take you?
To the Forbidden City.
And then the other major thing that you can see from outer space?
The Great Wall of China.
The Great Wall of China. We have these dignitaries coming. We want to take them to things that remind them of the West. Instead of taking them to things that emphasize Africa and say, look, this is Africa. So like, for example, if you go to Uganda and you take them to this impressive lake, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is the name of the lake? Lake Victoria.
Lake Victoria.
You take them to these great waterfalls between Zimbabwe and Zambia. What is it called?
Victoria Falls.
Victoria Falls. Africa.
It doesn't have Africa.
We have work to do, but we appreciate this question because this kind of question shows you the relevance of a platform like Kumbukeni.
Yeah.
But just for heads up, the name of the lake is what?
Nyam Lolwe. That's one of the African names for it.
Okay, but the name for the falls is Mosi Intunia.
Which has a meaning.
The smoke that thunders.
Of course.
So it's not really, you won't hear me call it Lake Victoria.
I'll hold you to that, brother.
And I never do. I never do.
You know I'm an elephant. I never forget. Anyway, Eddie Thorne had a comment on China, and our sister Sherry Perry asks, is China really a friend to Africa or just another global power after resources? We have 1 minute, brothers, to answer that. And to our audience, sorry, we can't answer all the questions.
China's relations with Africa is very different from China's relations in the 1960s when it was much more ideological because China needed Africa's help. China was surviving imperialism. China needed Africa to get into the United Nations, which it did. Taiwan was kicked out. China became a member of the Security Council. China's relation with Africa is much more commercially oriented right now. Getting resources from Africa is not exploitative as the West. It's never had an imperial agenda on Africa, but China needs to help Africa industrialize. Then if that happens, then I'll say China is a true friend of Africa.
Yeah, but something that was said recently in one of our shows is that Africa should also come to the table with China, not to ask for, as we were talking about the leaders, we were talking about neo-colonialists in Africa, not to ask for money for their pocket, but to ask for investment in Africa, that China helps with educating.
Not even just investment, ask for technology so you can build the factories.
Yes, ask for manufacturing within China. So don't just sit at the table to be told by China. Come with in a place of power, asking, having demands to better your people's well-being. Adesoji.
Okay, I would just like to end with
I have one more that I want to show from our audience, but go on.
Okay, in answer to this question, with China, everything is transactional. So if you make it transactional, you can get, just like Brother Milton said, transactional. What do you want? This is what I want, and that's it.
Yeah.
There is
our
no
sister. Mm-hmm. Go on, brother.
That's it.
Our sister Karen asks quickly as we run over time, Jesus and the white face, does it matter?
Yes, of course it matters. I mean, to me, I saw the first African Jesus when I was about maybe 12 years old in Tanzania. I was walking and I came upon a bookstore. I like going to bookstores in Dar es Salaam. And I saw a picture of a Jesus as an African.
Mm-hmm.
And I was taken aback. I was shocked. I said, what's wrong with this bookstore? I walked away. But then I came back. I said, wait, why can't it be? And I think that to me was really the beginning of the uplifting of my consciousness.
Yeah.
I started asking all these questions. Why are all these symbols in the image of Europeans? So yes, that's a very important question. And as Malcolm said, if you go to a church, a Black church, and you see a picture of a European Jesus, walk out of that church and go to another one where they have a picture of an African Jesus.
And I'm glad you said that, because in my visit to Kenya, this last trip I went back, I went into so many Kenyan homes where there was white Jesus, white Mary, all over the place. It was just white. These are Black people. Here's my question to you, Africans. If indeed Christianity teaches you that you are created in the image of God, you are Black, why do you have a white anything resembling or signifying that in your home? So let's think on that, and let's throw those white Jesuses and white Marys in the garbage and put up Black ones. Thank you all for joining us. Again, you can join us on patreon.com/Kumbukeni. You can subscribe here on YouTube. We are trying to get to that 1,000 subscribers so that we can reach more people. youtube.com/@Kumbukeni1. We thank you all for being with us. Asanteni. Siku njema.
Bye-bye.